Hello and welcome to my cellar one more time. This might be a short one tonight. Depends on how worked up I get. Didn't have a lot of comments to respond to. The video that we took coming back from Gamehole is spotty at best. I think we may still put it up for laughs. You can hardly hear it. Sometimes the rain's falling so hard, and other times the phone fell off the holder. But you know me, I'm all about spontaneous. I'm nothing if not spontaneous. Okay. I was reading an old issue of Imagine with Gary's new barbarian class, and I saw mention of some other character classes that were in the works. See the attached screenshot, which I have here. I'd love to hear your recollections about how these came to be, who all came up with the ideas, how'd you test them, adjust them, etc. Why didn't the Mystic, Savant, and Jester make the cut? Okay, well, number one, I don't know the slightest thing about those because those were all after me. And when it came to classes and well, I'll explain in a minute. All right, these classes were, and here's the quote. Well, there's the Barbarian, of course, but that is by no means all. In the wind are the Mystic, a Cleric subclass specializing in prediction, the Cavalier, a knightly noble subclass of fighter, the Savant, magic user specializing in arcane knowledge, the Mountebank, a thief subclass with a preference for the sort of thievery which goes on outside the dungeon, the Acrobat, a thief split class of the running leaping variety, the Jester, an entirely separate character class, and the Grand Druid, a 15th level Superman. Enough said. Well, okay, let me explain a couple things here. Gary always was prone to theorizing. Sometimes he'd muse out loud because something's in the wind, in Gary's parlance. Just means it's an idea batting around. Might only be batting around in Gary's head. Or it might have been batting around in Gary's head and somebody else's head that he was bouncing ideas off of. The proliferation of character classes was, as I see it, on Gary's part, a complete flip-flop. I believe he came to it because he saw it as a means of selling more stuff. And he was desperately trying to make an impact with the little companies that he was trying to run off and on at various times. The reason I say it's a total flip-flop was because in the early days of the game, and that is how, excuse me, we viewed or saw D&D at the time, the game. We were the caretakers, the creators, the stewards, the shepherds, and we spent a lot of time putting out what we perceived as forest fires or false trails. An example of a forest fire was all of a sudden everybody got a buck up their butt about spell points. No, completely negates the system as it was set up, and as any skilled game player or game designer will know, that you got to watch out. If you screw with one side, you got to do something on the other to balance it back. And we were constantly putting out fires such as that, silly character, what we've considered silly character classes, silly magic items, or downright offensive let's see, certain to be offensive to some people items, and we were constantly putting out those fires. Now, what Gary was musing about here, I have No idea, because I never read anything that he wrote in Imagine magazine. So, yeah, I'm guessing that was a magazine, or wherever he wrote it. I have no idea. Gary was also known, and this is no condemnation of my former friend, he was also known to tease. Well, we're thinking about this. Well, maybe we're going to go here. And it kept the idea pot churning, both in his head, in the design staff, and it was a way to throw out little trial balloons to see what people thought of some ideas that may or may not have been seriously considered for development. As I've said so many times, I think most of there's maybe a dozen, and I couldn't even tick them off on my fingers, maybe a dozen of the character classes that I can see some reasoning behind and some value. However, they can all be variants of the originals. The cleric, the magic user, and the fighting man. They're all variants thereof. Okay. Going back to a question we had earlier about a single PC fending off opponents without engaging in battle. So if I put it in this way without any qualifiers, does it make the question clear? Sort of, yes. And the writer concedes that both my answers were useful, but could I please clarify the concept of allowing PCs to trade an earlier round for the turn for a later one? Okay, we always did that. Most usually voluntarily, but not always. Now, the usually voluntarily was particular with missiles, a bow or a crossbow or something that's capable of using missiles in confined spaces. Want to hold off and not shoot right away until they determine, who's directing or whatever. And so they roll a 2 to go really, early in the round and elect to hold back till. Now, I don't say that they just get to keep holding back. They have to declare, okay, I rolled a 2. I think I want to go in 7. It's perfectly all right. You're handicapping yourself because as the question goes on, are you saying that the PCs would avoid engagement, or are you saying that in the case the PCs would simply take their lumps from any foe ranked in rounds preceding? Yes, that's what I'd say. If you want to go back, all right, then, back in the turn sequence, then yeah, you get lumps in front of you. If somebody's, lumping in front. I very seldom handle PC combat one-on-one. Very seldom. The old school style, presumed, assumed, subsumed, hope for a swirling, moving mass of fighting and chaos and stuff going on. And for a simpler image, think of cartoon fights where it's a big cloud of smoke and arms coming out and everything. Well, along those lines, it's a big swirling combat, everybody's moving, careful choreography, though in this case unchoreographed, but if you're making it into a movie, you'd have to choreograph it. And so therefore, if you hit something, unless, again, I don't generally go off one-on-one unless it makes more sense for the adversaries to do it. But it's just, okay, I hit something, and who it gets put on in this swirling, mixed up thing is a random determination. Sometimes, just like as I'm sure happened with archers, crossbowmen, and musketmen, some poor bugger can get hit 7 times and everybody escape unscathed. it happened in all those instances, and all those circumstances that I just mentioned. One guy got, the guy in the middle of the line, everybody fired to the middle of the line, whether they were trained to or not. That stuff often happened. And those 2-3 guys in the center line just got blown to bits, and everybody else was relatively unscathed. Combat can go the same way in my games. It's a swirling, whirling, what have you, and random damage is random people get hit, because what I'll do is when I'm rolling for the monsters, monster being small m, meaning anything opposed to the player character party, when I'm rolling for the monsters, excuse me, getting dry, if one of my rolls for them scores hits, and keep in mind that I know all the armor classes of the pre-gens, and so I know if it's a potential hit, and if it's a good enough hit and could hit anybody, I simply roll a die corresponding to the number of players who gets hit. If it would only hit a couple of people, then I roll between them and see who gets hit. Somebody's going to get hit. If it won't hit some people, they aren't in the roll. It's very fluid. It's how it seems to feel right at the time. If one of the monsters rolls something that'll hit anybody, well then I roll for the whole party. And who gets whacked. I've always done it that way. That's how Deathless Bob became a legend back in Carbondale. And I've told that story often enough. So yes, if you as the archer wanted to hold back and wait till later in the round, you can do that. However, if a bolt comes out of nowhere, a blow comes from, if the party's mixed up, and it could happen, then yeah, you got to stand your ground and take your potential lumps. Seems only fair. And having successfully taken your lumps, yep. Now, I mentioned involuntarily. If, for instance, the archer, and I have an archer with a composite bow listed in my pre-gen, so the archer is able to use the weapon in most confined, most limited circumstances. Excuse me. If, however, the archer was not carrying an arrow nocked on the bow, instead perhaps carrying their sidearm, or not carrying the bow at all, well then obviously, if combat ensues, there's going to be a penalty for knocking the arrow or slinging off the bow, off around the shoulders or whatever, and I'm most likely to assign it on the spot. Okay, you rolled a 2, you weren't knocked, okay, you shoot on 7. You didn't have such and such ready for a spell, well, you go on turn 2 of next round, or round 2 of next turn. Sorry. It's a sliding temporal thing that I try to interject a sense of realism, of verisimilitude to it, that you can't, something to shoot, sling your bow off, select an arrow, and draw it all in the second round of the first turn. Not in my world. Nobody's that fast unless they're hasted. Then hey, if you're hasted, might be just a blur. Okay, I'm going to read part of this because of a point that it makes and allows me to expand upon. Finding, fetching, collecting, designating, designing, customizing, and printing easy, quick reference sheets for rules, especially spells with short descriptions, often quite system-agnostic, D&D based, seems something really important. I imagine you have a style of organizing your table and reference material that's probably very interesting. If you have some online recorded video, no, I don't think so. You might find one of my Wheel of Blames might have been recorded at the last North Texas RPG convention. You might hunt and peck around in there, or you might not. I don't know. Since Doug died, what state what's in, but you might find that'd be the only place you'd find something like that. Let's see, go back to where I was here. Okay. Yeah, it's real important. As a player, if you can't be bothered, if you're a magic user and you can't be bothered to know what every one of your spells does, then you shouldn't be allowed to take it that day. If you got to look it up, you shouldn't be able to take it. Just my harsh reality rule. You want to be a magic user and play with cosmic forces? Well then, life's going to be a little harder. That's just kind of the way I go. As I've said many times, I play Clerics differently. But along that vein, 12 or so years ago, 15 years ago, when I was bringing back my OD&D, original D&D back to conventions and that, I realized that a lot of the potential players, while I'd give them a pre-gen, didn't necessarily have a copy of the old books. So I photocopied, and for the magic users, I made the Tome of Tim. Of course, I had Tim on the back, Death awaits you with pointy teeth. And so I made 3 each of these, and I passed it out to whoever was playing magic user or users. And they had it there. Just a simple comb binding that I made up in my own basement. I did one for the Clerics called the Tome of Life and Death. And the lectionary of life and death. And I did that for the Clerics. And of course, copying out of the books in the rotten shape that they were presented, it was posed some problems. And one spell was way up in the top of it because it was pretty crappy in the book. But then, this is what happens when you have a friend with too much time on his hands. And he comes up to you one day and says, "Hey, got something for you." And he gives me 3 little books. The Magic User Spell, 4 little books. The Druid Spell Book, the Clerical Spell Book, and the Illusionist Spell Book. All printed up very neatly and tidily and, more importantly, readable. And so I have those at the table if they're going to be used, if it's necessary for them to be used. Now, another, as an example simply of another, how important I place on everybody having access to the rules, is when I used to run a game at a couple of conventions that was based on the old the collectible ship card game, Pirates of Every Body of Water you never heard of. And I took it to another level and made it a very simple sailing game. And when I ran it at a couple of cons, I named the scenario Diving for Doubloons. I copied out the rules in here. I made some simple changes, put in some charts and stuff, so that everybody that sat down at the table had the same basic set of rules in their hands. So it's very important that you're playing with a level field. That does not mean that somebody gets to read everything out of the book. No. If you use Clerics prayers, as I do, yeah, I'd let them carry a prayer book because they have access to every one of the prayer/spells of each level that they're capable of throwing, or praying in this case. So them I'd let carry a prayer book. And it would just be word, few, not even that much of the whole book, but I'd let them certainly make up a prayer book of the name of this prayer, the specs of damage, range, etc., and have that certainly. I would make magic users know what their spells do. If they have a magic item that in effect adds extra spells to their arsenal, they damn sure need to know what that mini fireball stone on that magic necklace does, or what that ring, what powers that ring has, and whatever. Yeah, they got to know that. There's no looking it up. Now, as I was asked last week about what do you do when somebody finds something? Well, you don't use it right away if you don't read it. And not just, this is, read it as to understand it, as so as to master it, so as to be able to put it in your spell book. I like the idea of experience points penalties for demihumans rather than a level limit. Well, it kind of defeats the purpose. Because if you play them as demihumans with all their demihuman abilities, they're going to rack up points quicker than anything. And even if you penalize them, tax them part of them, they're still going to gain like the only reaper in the field with a scythe. Okay, when a DM screws up, how should they deal with it? Wing it. Let's say a DM mixes up an element of the game or rolls in the open when they should have rolled behind the fudge screen. Okay, we'll stop right here. Rolling out in the open, rolling behind a fudge screen, whatever. I roll behind the screen, I roll out in the open, off and on, all through the game with no emphasis on which ones are secret or which ones aren't, simply because it keeps them guessing. If I make a big deal of rolling through the ooh and studying them and all that, okay, I'm just doing it for dramatic effect. I'm the one who knows what the dice mean, what number you need, or whatever. So fudging can be done, if I choose to fudge, can be done just as easily in the open as it can be behind the screen. Again, that's because that's the way I run the games I run. How best to retract, recant, or otherwise correct a mistake that might cost the game in terms of fun and fair experience? Well, it's an interesting question. There's a lot of ways to go about it. And again, my first answer is wing it. Just figure out, play along with something that works. Okay, so when you wrote it up, you had this happening, or this trap waiting, or this predetermined set of circumstances, and you use something else. You're the only one that knows. Why tell? Well, that was supposed to. No, from now on, that item, that thing, that's the way it works. It's all made up anyway. If you do something that contradicts or runs even a bit contra to something you've done similarly before, so this magic was made by this race or mad wizard, and that magic was, so what? Okay. Just give those two spells a different first name. Big B's and Rigby's or whatever. It's only a screw up if you've told them you're gonna go look for the little pink ball, and then in the course of the adventure they never find a pink ball, and you don't understand why they're not getting excited about the little orange ball. Again, okay, all right, wing it. Oh yes, I guess it would be pink, or it would be orange, or whatever. Wing it. Now, I can't imagine. I'm sure it's possible, but I can't imagine an error happening during an adventure that would crock an entire campaign. Well, such and such was going to work like this and have these powers. Well, such and such now works like that and has those powers. It's still the such and such, and it has many powers. Pardon me. Nobody knows you made a mistake except you. Oh, listen, there's been lots of times when I pulled a monster out of my hat for the wheel of blame, got it wrong, according to the book, but it doesn't matter because everything on the wheel of blame, and nothing on the wheel of blame is exactly subject to the rules that work everywhere else. Only failing when I make a mistake. But again, there is no mistake. On the wheel, that's the way all bears behave. Or that's how many hit points they have, or whatever mistake I might have made. Never make mistakes about boulets. They're just always nasty, always hungry, and love to eat ponies. How do I handle jousting in D&D? Tourneys and jousts are an important part of a knight's life and seem woefully underrepresented in D&D rules, any edition really. The idea of resolving the entire setup and judging a jousting coming down to a single attack roll doesn't seem like it would really reflect it properly to me. Okay, get a copy of the jousting rules from Chainmail. Now, at one time, one of the results was no either or. You just, if something happened to you on the first pass, you were going to get knocked on your ass in the second pass, because if that one thing happened to you, well, then you could only respond the next pass. Anyway, something about being unsteady or whatever. And one day when I was talking to Gary, I was up at one of the Lake Geneva game conventions back in the day, and I told him that I was using it in class teaching. And he goes, oh, well, there's a flaw. And I said, yeah, I know, but so far we haven't played it long enough for the class to catch on. And he says, okay, we'll change this and give it this or that. And so instead of only a single result, now you had a 50-50 of taking advantage of the fact that you had just jostled or rattled, cuffed him a mighty blow without knocking him off, and he's a little shaken. So I don't remember off the top of my head. You can go to the GaryCon, the Legends of Wargaming, and I'm sure Paul Stormberg probably. Well, I'd be willing to wager a small amount that Paul Stormberg has the chainmail jousting rules up there, because the jousting is a big part every year at GaryCon. They have lists and they pair off and advance down, down the row, down the brackets as they get smaller and smaller until two meet at the end. So he's probably got something, the exact numbers, but it's a really nice little clean jousting system. You aim at certain areas of your opponent, and your opponent does the same. And it's just kind of a simple cross-reference thing. And you can shatter a lance, and of course that earns points. If you get unhorsed, we just played that to the loss. You made 3 passes through the lists, and if there was no clear-cut result, then it was well, too bad. There was no clear-cut result. 3 passes, each scored a point. Good show. Go have some mead. But actually, it is an easy, simple little system that you can have quite a lot of fun with. Do I like the idea of the fighter being the only ones to use two-handed weapons, also known as great weapons? All right. Well, yeah. However, anybody, whether it's the barmaid or Sir Duffinal, can pick up anything and try to use it. Effectively wield it? Yes, I think that should be the purview of fighters because they would have had training and experience and practice. However, if there's a couple of clerics and a thief trapped in a room and there's a great sword laying there, well, can't give it to the clerics because it's a sword, but you can certainly let the thief try. And if the thief rolls, 18, 19, or even a 20, well, gee, he got lucky and the opponent impaled himself on it or, whatever. But to be proficient, to fight straight up with no minuses, absolutely. I believe that only a fighter with their training and experience should be able to handle a great sword or, a great axe like that. Certainly. That's to handle it adeptly. Should PCs eat mushrooms they find growing in dungeons? What's the worst that could happen? Well, that would depend on your DM, and he might just make you all sit there for 20 minutes listening to his favorite thing he knows you hate, and you all went on a trip. However, if there's a cleric in the group, Purify Food and Water is a first level spell, and if you don't want to check to see, just throw it on there, and if it wasn't poisonous, okay. If it was, it's not anymore, and it's edible either way. Do I think that's a wise idea? Hell no. Unless, and now here's a level of mycology you might not want to go into, unless you have like a hobbit or a ranger or someone who can justifiably claim to have a knowledge of mushrooms and which ones are edible and which ones aren't. In which case, all right, you have a whole nother avenue to go explore. If they're just going to run around and pick mushrooms and go, I eat it, what does it do? Well, without further incriminating myself, we'll just simply say that many strange, wonderful, bizarre, and horrifying things might happen. Again, having that local expert, that person with woodsman skill can tell you that's a hen and chicks and tasty as all hell, and that's a purple nightshade, and if it doesn't kill you, you'll go tripping for hours or days. You'll fight with invisible demons, or however you want to explain it without metagaming. What's my opinion on magic users being hunted down by clerics? Clerics having a divine plan on exterminating all traces of magic. I think that's an interesting dynamic. I think it probably makes some really good books. As I think about it a little, I wonder, though, about pitting 2 of the 3 main root sources of all the player characters against them each other. Realistically, you obviously couldn't have both in a group, or they'd be killing each other. If you had a strain of clerics, a sect that's very numerous and very annoying and very public with an anti-magic agenda. They become a new wandering monster for the magic users personally, and for the group probably. So it would make an interesting current running through the background of your campaign. Again, keep in mind that you don't want to produce a situation where you have warring PCs in the same group. That never ends well, and friendships are often damaged. Often. In my anecdotal experience, pardon me, I'm looking to see what's up here. Oh, old cartridge. But again, it makes an interesting storyline, and it makes an interesting underlying plot. Right. Trying to wrap one's head around the longevity that demihumans, such as elves with lifespans of up to 2,000 years, and dwarves pretty high too, and the amount of time they would have to refine their talents, intelligence, and wisdom, all the memories, all the activities, is kind of beyond our comprehension. The level limits for old D&D demihumans fails in the face of reason. You're trying to apply reason to fantasy? Whoa. I see a contradiction here. You can't have a lot of both. You have to have the willing suspension of disbelief to play any of this. Whether it's Metamorphosis Alpha, Gamma World, Dungeon Crawl Classics, Mutant Crawl Classics, D&D, Pathfinder, you have to be able to willingly suspend that initial disbelief, that skepticism. Well, I think when you do that, it precludes trying to apply any logic to it. It is what it is. If you don't like the rule, I don't give a damn. Who would give a damn? The only people that should give a damn are the players in your campaign. And if they don't give a damn, then it's not a problem. If they don't like the idea, then I guess it is. Gary did it to preserve his ideal that human heroes would be the archetype heroes of this game. Remember, this came from wargaming. It came from chainmail. They didn't have a bunch of wizards early on. The fantasy supplement came later as a result of, we don't have any of this stuff, let's make it up. And they did. And one thing led to another. If you don't like the lifespans, fine. So what? You're not going to have a campaign that's going to last 1,000 years and see that guy die of old age anyway. And I still say that playing demihumans is just min-maxing. My opinion, but I don't agree to it. All right, now I'm going to address this one more time and point out just how wrong people can be. Pardon me. I feel like a lot of these level limits of demis, were put there by Gary Gygax in the back of his mind, knowing reverse psychology and agitation psychology of a competitive gamer to rebel in DIY homebrew. The old proverb, give 1,000 monkeys and one typewriter. Oh yeah, well you didn't even get that right. 1,000 monkeys with typewriters, and one of them will type something out. Yeah, well, need a lot of monkeys. I think Gary was well aware of the adolescent restless curiosity, rebellious mind to live in. No, you couldn't be more wrong. Now, what Gary teased with about, maybe some new, and what actually came out. But believe me, and in the beginning, that is just total bullshit. I can tell you now, that's just bullshit. Gary tried and tried and tried for the longest time to keep his game pristine, the way he envisioned it. Fighting men, clerics, and magic users. All right? The idea that hobbits as a race really didn't need to be formed, and I'm not sure why it did. If you went through and read all the Tolkien books, okay, they were a different species in that, okay, they were hobbit DNA strands and we weren't, okay. But in terms of what they could and couldn't do, we don't know if hobbits had clerics, okay. We know they didn't have magic users, but we know that some of them were very dufty fighters. No way that Gary did that just to make people think that they're going ahead and go into it anyway. That's just silly talk. It's not his. This I know from many conversations was not his intent. As I said earlier tonight, we peed on little fires like this all the time, trying to keep the game from running off into bizarre shoots and no longer resembling what we were still trying to form and proselytize and teach and convert people to. No. Didn't want people. It was the longest time in terms of when the game was published before I even felt like it would be cool to put in a few NPCs that were later playable as player characters, but they were put in as NPCs. Now, in the early years of D&Ding, NPCs could become like long-term companions, or they were short one-time, guns for hire. Pardon me. Again, I referenced Jolly Blackmore and the knights because they had pack bearers and torch bearers that would be with them again and again and again, and then they'd sadly die and they'd sit around the campfire afterwards toasting their great torch bearer or whatever. It was NPCs of that nature, of that application, were a chance, though somewhat perverted and limited, they were a chance for the DM to play with you also a little. They didn't actually play the character, but if somebody said, well, so-and-so, is going to do, and they, no, he's not. All right. Or they used them as specialists, safe crackers, and things of that nature. There were one-off type people that had special powers or special abilities. And yeah, okay, the ranger became a actual playable class, as did the druid and the thief, and a couple of those were created by people from my old original group because they played fighting men so along one line that they eventually developed an NPC, the ranger. Great tracker, skilled outdoors, keep you from getting jumped by stuff. Great guy to hire on a long distance outdoor adventure. Great guy to hire. Got a share of the loot, whatever the share was. What's else? Nothing else. Golly, that brings me to the end. Well, No game cons going on until after the first of the year that I'm going to. There may be others. Looking forward to Total Con. Always one of my favorite cons to go to. Eat all that good home cooking. They don't give me a meal allowance. They give me a point to the door where the food is. And so I'm good for that. In the meantime, I almost forgot. A book review. Not something I do very often. Not something. And a plug. Go to the Dwarven Forge Kickstarter and check out what they're doing. They're called reliquaries. And it's a place to put that famous dice of yours. That it's an honor spot for that favorite die. And I think I even did a short video. I did a couple. I don't know what they're going to use. I know, Pole, I guess, yeah. The lady that played the redheaded baby vampire in True Blood did the first one, talking about the day she rolled a natural 20 and actually lived in the dragon fight, and therefore that die deserved a special place. Now, I'm going to do another book review. I already told you about Carrie Burgoyne's The First Fable, and I hear the second fable is out, and I'm getting ready to read it as soon as I acquire a copy. One of my favorite new fantasy authors is Hans Cummings. He's a local writer from Indiana, and he has done some excellent stuff. The Scars of the Sundering trilogy, and the whole thing starts with what you, as a reader, come to become aware is basically a dungeon from a D&D game that's become self-aware, and you just kind of fall down into it and develops a life of its own. This isn't it, though. It takes place later on that world, and there are references to those things. It's called The Summer of Crows. Really, really good fantasy. I really recommend. We're friendly acquaintances. He's not my buddy. I'm not trying to sell games for him. I'm telling you, as a fantasy readers, this is well worth checking out. 2 strong feminine leads. So, if you're looking for 2 strong feminine leads in a really tasty fantasy novel, Summer of Crows by Hans Cummings. And on that note, I'll say Dodata Govi.
Oh, hello. I'm still figuring out when this thing starts. Welcome to my cellar.
He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs. Still quite a feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Last man around when them rates went down. Calling Gary in that Lake Geneva town. Hey Gary, it's an awful mess. Let me edit, we'll have success. D&D and Dragon Magazine. He's a curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs, but he's still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Magic missile, it's a mortar shell. Make it hit in the first level spell. Brought psionics to the game to attack that wizard's brain. ESR and fantasy, collection of micro armory. Titan with tramp under a tree, high as could be. He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs, but he's still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Curmudgeon.